Good morning. Welcome to all my Catholic morality students. I hope that you are staying safe in your home. I'm coming to you live from my house. Uh, Ice is pretty bad out there. Fell this morning. I'm all right though. Hope you don't have that same problem. Now, uh, if you remember from class last time, we spoke about the problem of evil. Um, and today, in this kind of weird format, you got to kind of bear with me. You'll only be able to hear my voice, but you will be able to see the slides, at least hopefully, if I knew anything what I was doing. We talked about last time the problem of evil. And today what I want to do is I want to sort of give an answer to that. Maybe not an answer, but a reply, looking at my favorite writer, a guy named Fyodor Dostoevsky. And as we're going to see, his answer to the problem of evil is a very simple one, and it's love, specifically humble, selfless love. So I'll try and keep this video pretty short. I don't want to bore you on your snow day. I think you should enjoy it. So let's talk about Dostoevsky. All right. His name is Fyodor. It's literally Theodore, but just with an F. Fyodor. And then the trick to say his last name is to say the word toy in the middle. So Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky. So Dostoevsky, he was born in Moscow, Russia in 1821. His family was middle class. His father was a doctor. We think of doctors today as being majority upper class, but at that time, at a middle class, his father was a doctor at a hospital for people that did not have any means to pay for medical care. His mother died when he was only 15. He was shortly after sent off to a military academy. And then by the time Dostoevsky was 18, his father also had passed away, and there's speculation that he may have even been murdered. Dostoevsky studied engineering, but he absolutely hated it. The second that he graduated from the academy, he got a job as an engineer for about 3 months, and then he quit. Couldn't stand it. So he decided, he had this idea that he was going to be a writer, which, if you know anything about someone that wants to write but isn't very famous, don't really make a whole lot of money. Dostoevsky, for the beginning of his writing career, was in abject poverty, but he was able to get some success. His first major work of any success was called Poor Folk. He was able to sort of come into contact with a lot of the best writers in Russia at that time after that. But this kind of got him into a little bit of trouble. So he got mixed up with a group of revolutionaries that wanted to overthrow the Russian government. They wanted to overthrow the Tsar. More specifically, this group was a utopian group. So you guys are probably very familiar with utopian ideology, the idea that you could create a perfect sort of community, a perfect society, if only you had the right circumstances, if you only had the right laws, if you only had the right place in which this community existed. So an example of this in Indiana is New Harmony, right? You guys all know New Harmony was created as a utopian society, and now it's just kind of a town. So this utopian group, they were also, their belief was that socialism would be the ideal type of government. And at this time, Dostoevsky himself was also an atheist, very strong atheist. This got him into some trouble because in 1849, Dostoevsky and members of this group were arrested. They sat in jail for 8 months before one day an individual came in and told Dostoevsky and the others that they were to be executed. They were led out to the prison yard. They were blindfolded. They were tied to a stake, and they were about to be killed by firing squad. Dostoevsky himself completely believed this was the moment that he was going to die. He had no question about it. But at the last second, with the guns drawn, a messenger comes and tells them that their sentence is not execution, but in fact 10 years hard labor. Dostoevsky later found out that this sort of mock execution was a fake from the start. It was actually part of the punishment. which is just horrifying to think about, that you would, take these people out there and have them think that they were going to be executed. One of the members of this group actually, after this experience of, thinking he was going to die and then having this reprieve at the last second, he actually suffered a mental breakdown and never recovered. And I'll tell you, this moment changed Dostoevsky's life forever as well. Just imagine how you would feel thinking that you were going to die, thinking that your execution was in the next few moments, and then all of a sudden you're sort of granted this new life. It also did take a toll on Dostoevsky's health. So after this mock execution, he began to suffer from epilepsy. So epilepsy is a neurological disorder that causes people to have seizures. It was not very well understood in the 19th century. And Dostoevsky, really for the rest of his life, from 1849 till he dies in 1881, 3 or 4 times a year, he would have major seizures and he would be really bedridden for weeks. So this was a disease he suffered for the rest of his life. He was sent to Siberia. So Siberia is in the eastern part of Russia. It is very rural, very, very, very cold, and it is not a wonderful place to live. He worked there for 4 years in a labor camp, and then he also did 6 years of forced military service in the Russian army. So a total of 10 years that he served. During this time in prison and also in his military career, that he made a spiritual transformation. In prison, the only book he was allowed to have was the Gospels. He read them backwards and forwards. He knew the Gospels like the back of his hand. And although he had formerly been an atheist, he had been a socialist, he had been someone that wanted to overthrow the Russian government, he makes a sincere conversion to Orthodox Christianity. After he is done with his 10 years of punishment, he is able to marry. His first wife actually only survives 7 years in that marriage before she passes away. He also has one son from her, but the son dies after only 3 days. So this is a man that his parents died when he was teenagers. When he was a teenager, he went to prison. He literally was on the brink of being executed. His first wife dies, his first child dies, and then he's suffering all the while from this epilepsy. This is a man that knew suffering. He knew suffering. This was not just a thought experiment for him. And I think that is in many ways what makes his writing so deep and so meaningful, at least in my opinion. He is able to marry a second time, and he has a much more fruitful marriage from that. He is able to have children, and really from 1860 on, he really comes into his own as a writer. So I want to look at 4 of his most important texts, and I want to start with one with sort of a strange name. It's called The Notes from the Underground. Okay, so this is a quote from the Notes from the Underground, but I'll get to that in just a second. Notes from the Underground is a story about a man that calls himself the Underground Man. He is a very nervous individual, very self-conscious, but that really doesn't matter for our purposes today. The Notes from the Underground is Dostoevsky's rejection of this idea of a utopian society. Remember, formerly when he was younger, he was a believer in utopianism. He thought it really could work. But in the Notes from the Underground, we see that he rejects this idea. He rejects this idea that you can create for yourself heaven on earth. He rejects this idea that if you only give people the right material goods, if you only create for them the perfect society and the perfect government, that they will be happy. Dostoevsky instead says, no, you can give people all the earthly things they ever want. You can give them all the comforts they ever want, but they're still not going to be satisfied. Because true satisfaction for human beings is in the soul. You must satisfy their soul. Let's look at this quote. He's talking about humanity in general, He says, shower upon him every earthly blessing, drown him in a sea of happiness, so that nothing but bubbles of bliss can be seen on the surface, and give him economic prosperity, such that he would have nothing else to do but sleep, eat cakes, and busy himself with the continuation of the species. Even then, out of sheer ingratitude, sheer spite, man could play you some nasty trick. So give humanity, give an individual all the bliss in the world, everything they could ever want, all the economic prosperity. All they've got to do is sleep, eat cake, and have sex, essentially. Even then, in this perfect little society, people would still do something wrong just for the fact that they would be able to do something wrong, just because they wanted to. But it's even more than that. Dostoevsky is telling us, like I mentioned before, that it doesn't matter how much society progresses. It doesn't matter how much economic prosperity we have. Humanity will still find something to agonize about. If you think about in our modern day, in the United States or in other prosperous parts of the world, we have absolutely everything we could ever want, everything that we could ever need. We really want for nothing. We have all the food, we have, sufficient sanitation, we have plumbing, we have water, we have heat, we have sufficient clothing. But what happens with that? Are we completely content? Are people today much, 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 much happier than our ancestors? Are people today much, much happier in the United States than in countries that are not as prosperous? No, that's not true. If you think about it, we have more free time, right? If you don't have work, you have more free time. How do we feel? We get bored, all right? If we don't have to worry about our next meal or where our water's coming from, or if we have sufficient shelter, what do? We get worried about how we look, all right? Even though most of us have everything we could ever need, there is still greed. We still have a desire for power. And it seems that we become more and more dissatisfied with even the smallest things. He rejects this idea that I think we sometimes often feel, that if only this happened, or if that happened, then we would be happy. Because I think we oftentimes think to ourselves, or people think to themselves, if I only had the perfect job, if I only married the right person, if I could only get that divorce, if I could only have that perfect house, if I could only invent that perfect sort of invention, if we could only have this thing that would fly us around the world, if we could only change the government, then all things would go well. It's not necessarily true. Satisfaction is more in the soul. It's not necessarily in the circumstances that surround you. Okay, so that's Notes from the Underground. Now, I want to move on to his next great work, more famous, Crime and Punishment. All right, Crime and Punishment. The main character in the novel is a guy named Raskolnikov, which is just a great name because in English it sounds literally like the word rascal. Raskolnikov is a young university student in St. Petersburg, Russia. He is, or at least he thinks of himself as being very, very highly intelligent. Raskolnikov has this idea that he is superior to all other people he ever has encountered. In fact, he has this idea that there are some people in human society that are just far, far, far greater than those around them. Some examples that he gives are Julius Caesar and Napoleon. These people are so talented, they're so creative, they're so their character is so great, they are so courageous, they are so strong that they don't really have to live by the same rules that the rest of society has to live by. For him, Julius Caesar, Napoleon, and himself, they sort of live beyond good and evil. Good and evil does not apply to them. Sometimes, for them, Raskolnikov thinks, they have to just sort of do what must be done in order to bring about good for humanity. Now, what does this mean? Well, in the story, Raskolnikov is a university student. He's a poor college student. He doesn't have a lot of money. And he's pretty upset about this because for him, he's like, okay, I'm very talented. I'm very smart. I'm one of these great individuals. He describes himself as one in a billion. He said, why is it that I have so little money? Why am I living in desolation when other individuals that really don't provide much to society are living in comfort? So what does he do? He thinks about this little old pawnbroker down the street that he thinks is a very nasty person, an old woman that he knows has a bunch of cash stored up in the safe in the back of her store. This should sound familiar for you. This is where I got the inspiration for our little story about Mr. Blue. But what does he do? He decides that he is going to go and have this woman killed, and he is going to steal the money out of her safe. And he's got it all planned out, right? He's this superior individual. He thinks, oh, I've got it down to a science. No one will ever know that I've done this. It will be perfect. But the problem is, whenever he gets there to actually commit the murder, he finds that he doesn't he's not as cold and as calculated as he thought. He's not able to, perfectly carry it out. As you can see in this picture right here, he actually hits the woman with the wrong side of the axe, and it ends up being a disaster. She does die, but he didn't know that the woman's sister actually lived in the same apartment. The woman's sister comes in and he has to take her life as well in order to cover up his crimes. So what was originally supposed to just be a single murder now becomes a double murder. And then to make matters worse, whenever he goes to open up the safe, he can't open it. He ends up leaving with just a couple of jewels that really aren't worth anything. In fact, he even ends up just throwing the jewels into the river. So it goes from him thinking this, I must do this. This is for the betterment of humanity because I'm a great person. I deserve this. To now him having committed a double murder for absolutely no reason. The rest of the novel is essentially Raskolnikov sort of dealing with what he's done. And what he finds is that he is not this, cold, calculated individual that is above questions of morality, questions of good and bad. What he finds is he actually feels very, very, very terrible about what he has done. He feels remorse, and it sort of disturbs him. How could it be that I feel so terrible about these things if I'm above questions of good and evil? The sort of main climax of the book is this conversation that Raskolnikov has between himself and Sonia. Sonia is actually a prostitute in the story. Now, she's a prostitute not because she enjoys being a prostitute. In fact, I don't think anyone enjoys that. She's a prostitute because her family has absolutely no money. Her father is a drunk. He spends all of the family's money on alcohol. In fact, throughout the course of the story, he goes out one night drunk and he gets run over by a carriage and he actually dies, and the family has absolutely no money for the funeral. So she's a prostitute not because she desires to, but out of really a selfless act out of her heart for her family, which is interesting. The rest of society looks down on Sonia as this sort of immoral individual, this untouchable person. She's a prostitute. She must be horrible. But you learn throughout the book that she's actually the greatest of all of the people in the story. She's the most kind-hearted, the most giving, the most self-giving, the most loving. So Sonia and Raskolnikov are having this conversation. They're talking about whether or not God exists. Raskolnikov says, no, there is no God. Sonia says, there is a God. She pulls out the Gospels. She opens to the book of John, the Gospel of John, and she reads there the resurrection of Lazarus, right? This man who was dead, and Christ came and said, Lazarus, come out of the tomb. I tell you, arise. And he comes out of the tomb with his burial cloths on, right? He's given new life. Raskolnikov, hearing this, He thinks, in the same way that Lazarus was dead, could I not too be raised from my sinfulness? Raskolnikov asks, is it not possible that even God's mercy could touch me as well? And this really changes Raskolnikov as a person. He realizes that the only way that he is ever going to find peace within his soul for what he has done is if he confesses, if he takes full responsibility for what he did. And in the end, that is what he does. He goes and he confesses to the police, and he accepts his punishment, and he is sent off to Siberia, where there is hope, because Sonia, in her love, in her self-giving, goes with Raskolnikov to Siberia as well to help him. All right, let's move on to next great novel. One with the best title. It's called The Idiot. Okay, and The Idiot is about a character whose name is Prince Mishkin. Mishkin is described by Dostoevsky as almost an ideal, sort of like Christ. Mishkin is sort of what it would be like if Christ was a human being in his time period. Mishkin is kind-hearted, he is loving, he is self-giving, he is always seeing the best in other people. But the interesting thing is, because he's so kind-hearted and because he sees the good in other people, what do other people do to him? Well, they constantly take advantage of his kind-heartedness. They constantly take advantage of him seeing the best in them. So he's constantly being played tricks on. People are constantly making fun of him. And the title of the book is called The Idiot because everyone thinks that Prince Mishkin is an idiot. They don't understand how it could be that someone could be so kind-hearted and so loving. They don't get it. They think he's just dumb. The part of the idiot that I wanted to talk about is Prince Mishkin is telling a story of him experiencing a execution, which again, this is taken from Dostoevsky's own life experience. So he's talking about this prisoner that he saw executed, and he sort of gets inside the mind of the prisoner, and he explains what it would be like to be that person, what it would be like to be that person that knew that their life was about to end in the next 10 minutes, that their execution was coming and they couldn't stop it. What Mishkin says, and really what Dostoevsky says through him, is that in those last 10 minutes of life, things change for you. You begin to see the world in a different way. You begin to look around at just the mundane things that you would have maybe never noticed, and they're actually very beautiful to you. You see everything as a sort of gift in a way that you don't otherwise. So, for instance, he looks out at the trees on the way the prisoner's in the carriage about to be taken to his execution block, and he looks out at the trees and he sees them as just beautiful. He looks out at the people waiting to watch the execution, and he sees them as beautiful. Interesting, he looks out and he sees a beggar on the side of the street, and otherwise we might say, well, I would never want to be that beggar. But for this person that is about to be executed, he says, I would do anything to trade places with that beggar. I would do anything to just have the gift of life, even if it means that I am homeless, right? Even if it means that I am a beggar. The gift of life is beautiful enough. So let's look at this quote here. I don't understand how one can walk by a tree and not be happy at the sight of it, or to speak with a man and not be happy in loving him. There are so many things at every stop so beautiful. Beauty saves the world. Beauty saves the world. That's something that we'll come back to at the end that I want to ask you about. At the last moment when the prisoner is being put into the blocks, he's actually going to be beheaded. And he looks up and he sees the glare of the sun reflecting off of the dome of a church. And he says it's the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen in his life, right? All of us see the sun. All of us see the sun reflecting off of different things all the time. And for most of us, and most of the time, we really don't care. It's like, okay, it's the sun, it's some object, really don't care. But in this moment, when he knows that life is so precious, this becomes something beautiful. The interesting thing is then Prince Mishkin asks, what would it be like if you knew that you were going to die? You thought adamantly that you were going to die, and then at the last second, you weren't executed. You didn't die. You were given new life. Remember, this is something Dostoevsky actually experienced himself. And what Dostoevsky tells us through The Idiot is that if we thought we were going to die and then we were given this new life, we would live with much more gratitude. We would be much more capable of showing kindness to others because every moment would be a gift. We wouldn't get angry about the things that we usually do. We'd be able to enjoy the simple things much easier. And just think about it. Imagine if all of society lived life with this sort of gratitude. Perhaps society would think that you were an idiot. The interesting thing about the book is it actually ends in a sort of dark tragedy. So Mishkin, the idiot, he's actually thrown into an insane asylum, because the rest of society believes that he's mad. They believe he's insane because they just do not understand how he can be so good. They think his goodness is a sort of mental illness, which I think tells us what Dostoevsky would think if Christ returned. Perhaps people would just think he was a lunatic. Okay, let's move on to Dostoevsky's last great book and my favorite book of all time. It is called The Brothers Karamazov. I've mentioned it before in class. And The Brothers Karamazov, it is called The Brothers Karamazov because it is about four brothers with the last name Karamazov, the Karamazov family. So you have here the little dude with the halo and the wings and the Bible. That is Alyosha. Alyosha is only 19 years old. He is studying to become a monk. On the far left with the lady, you have Dmitri. Dmitri is your classic incontinent person. He is good-hearted. He wants to do good, but he also has a great love of money, of women, of gambling, and of alcohol. And this gets him into all kind of trouble. On the far right, you have Smerdyakov. Don't really mention him. He's kind of a minor character. And then in the middle on the left with the little college graduation hat is Ivan. Ivan is the most intelligent of all the brothers. He also is a nihilist. He also is an atheist. All right. And Ivan and Alyosha, they sort of are always competing with one another in a way. At least when it comes to their concepts of God and of theology. So before I talk about Ivan and Alyosha a little bit more, I wanted to say the Brothers Karamazov, the book, if I had to say what it was about or what it was, to put it simply, I think it's Dostoevsky's answer to the problem of evil, or at least his reply to the problem of evil. It's his way of trying to answer back to why it is that so much of the world has suffering, why so much of the world experiences suffering every day, and that this is a reality. Like I said at the very beginning, one of the things that's beautiful about Dostoevsky is I think he's not afraid to run away from this problem of evil. Or I'm sorry, he does not run away from the problem of evil. He says, no, if you are going to truly be a Christian, you have to recognize that there are people in this world that suffer every single day. There are people in this world that suffer every single day that people don't even know about. So let's get to Ivan and Alyosha. So they're having a discussion about whether or not God exists. Alyosha says yes, and Ivan is very adamant, no, God does not exist. And his reasoning is this: if God existed, why is there so much suffering in this world? How could a good God allow this to happen? And to sort of illustrate his point, he tells a story that's pretty graphic. He talks about a little boy, 3 or 4 years old, that was a serf. So you guys probably are familiar with serfdom. So serfdom was something sort of akin to slavery, where individuals would be forced to work a piece of land for a particular landowner. It was not as cruel as slavery in the United States, but it still could be very cruel. So this 3 or 4 year old serf boy, he gets in trouble for whatever reason, and the landowner comes out, and to punish this little boy, he has his dogs unleashed on him. The little child runs away. Eventually the dogs catch him, and they actually tear this child apart. It's horrifying to read about. And Dostoevsky wanted us, when we read this, to feel this suffering and this evil and this senselessness. And he does a great job of it. When you read it, you're sort of left thinking, well, maybe perhaps Ivan is right. Maybe there is no God. Or at least maybe this God isn't a good God. Now, Dostoevsky, he presents a response to this. And he presents a response to this through the figure of Father Zosima. So Father Zosima, he is the abbot at the monastery where Alyosha is thinking about becoming a monk. He is very wise. He is very well respected for his spirituality. He is known throughout the region for his kindness, for his love that he shows for other individuals, and for his wisdom. He's very old, and in fact, in the book, he is on his deathbed. He is dying. I wanted to mention the character of Father Zosima was actually inspired by a real person. So this is Father Ambrosi, who was the abbot at a monastery that Dostoevsky visited often in his later life, and he would actually seek spiritual guidance from Father Ambrosi himself. So he actually was inspired by a real person, which I think is pretty cool. But Father Zosima, he is on his deathbed. He is dying. His monks are surrounding him, and he sort of is giving his last explanations, or his last words on the meaning of life and what is life all about. Something that someone might say when they knew that their life was coming to an end. Now, what Father Zosima has to say is that even in the face of evil, even in the face of suffering, the only response is love. The only response is selflessness. The only way to combat hatred is with love. So what I want to do is I want to just look at some of the words that Father Zosima has to say in the story. Let's look at this first one here. He says, look around you at the gifts of God, the clear sky, the pure air, the tender grass, the birds. Nature is beautiful and sinless, and only we are sinful and foolish. And we don't understand that life is heaven, for we have only to understand that, and will at once be fulfilled in its beauty. We shall embrace each other and weep. So Zosima is saying here, there's actually a great deal of beauty in this world. Yes, there's pain. Yes, there's suffering. But there's also great beauty. And really, what matters is the way that you look at things, right? This is something you guys have mentioned before in class, that attitude has a very, very big component of being happy and of finding happiness and peace. If you can look at the world and see the beauty in it, it's going to be much better. Okay, keep going. He says, the world has proclaimed the reign of freedom, especially of late. But what do we see in this freedom of theirs? Nothing but slavery and self-destruction. For the world says, you have desires, and so satisfy them. Don't be afraid of satisfying them and even of multiplying our desires. That is the modern doctrine. In that, they see freedom. So Zosima is saying, if you look at the modern world, it tells us you have desires, you have wants, you have things that you think that you need, Go and get them, take them, right? Satisfy your desires. Whatever your will is, do it. You do you, right? The McDonald's jingle, what was it? What you want is what you get at McDonald's today, right? Whatever you want, take it, have it, right? It's a sort of hedonism, saying that the best way to satisfy ourselves is to just take whatever we want, take whatever we please. But notice what Father Zosima says here. He says, and what follows from this rite of multiplication of desires? In the rich, it leads to isolation and spiritual suicide. In the poor, it leads to envy and murder. So it's not that the rich are, so much more satisfied than anyone else. In fact, oftentimes it can lead them to isolation. It can lead them to a sort of spiritual decay. And it makes sense, right? If you only seek your satisfaction in worldly goods, then your spirituality is going to decay. Then he says, what about in the poor? Well, in the poor, it just makes them want the things that the rich have. And it leads to envy. It can lead to a desire for violence. He says here, for they have been given rights, but they have not been shown the means of satisfying their desires. We have been told you have the right to be happy, right? It's in our Declaration of Independence. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But we haven't really been told the correct way to find that happiness. It's not in just simply satisfying our desires and getting whatever we want. There's something about happiness that is in our soul. Okay, let's move on to the next quote. He says here, and really this is where he gives his answer. Obedience, fasting, and prayer are laughed at. So people sort of throw these things off, say, well, they're useless, they're not needed. Yet only through them lies the way to real, true freedom. I cut off my superfluous and unnecessary desires. I subdue my proud and wanting will and chastise it with obedience. And with God's help, I attain freedom of spirit and with it spiritual joy. So that it's not through having whatever we please and being able to have whatever we want that gives us happiness and gives us freedom. But in fact, it's being able to sort of control ourselves. It's being able to be obedient to God's desires for us. That is what gives us spiritual joy. He asked the question, which is most capable of conceiving a great idea and serving it? Is it the rich man in his isolation, or the man who has freed himself from the tyranny of material things and habits? Who is more capable of serving others? The one who has absolutely everything, or the one who doesn't need anything? I'll leave that to you. Now, I'll tell you, all of his spirituality obviously is deeply Christian. It is focused on the gospel. So I want to look at this passage from the Gospel of Matthew here that I think is really central to Father Zosima. Jesus summoned them and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and the great ones make their authority over them felt. But it shall not be so among you. Rather, whoever wishes to be great among you shall be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you shall be your slave. So he's saying, leaders of the world, rulers of the world, they make their authority felt, right? Either through their decrees, through their laws, through their military might, through their political strength. And that the world tells us this is power. But Jesus tells us something very, very different. He says power is not earthly power. Power is giving of oneself to others. It's in rejecting our own will and in fact becoming the slave of others, saying, not my will be done, but your will be done. So Father Zosima, you're going to see, he picks up on this. He says, brothers, have no fear of men's sin. Love a man even in his sin, for that is the semblance of divine love and is the highest love on earth. So Zosima, he sort of asks, What about people that cause us great suffering? What about people that cause us great pain? My dog's barking in the background, sorry. What about people that do this to us? How are we supposed to respond to them? Well, he says, even individuals that you encounter that are sinful, even individuals that you encounter that harm you, he says, even to them you must show love. Because this is what divine love is all about, right? God does not love us human beings because we deserve it. It's not like we are so great to God and then he says, "Oh, I will sort of accept your love and respond back to you." No, he loves us even though none of us deserve it. And if God loves us in our sin, can we not also love our fellow man in their sin? Sometimes one stands perplexed, especially in the sight of men's sin, and wonders whether one should use force or humble love. So people that do wrong to us, how do we respond? With force or with humble love? He says, always decide to use humble love. If you resolve on that once and for all, you may subdue the whole world. Loving humility is marvelously strong, the strongest of all things, and there is nothing else like it. So that true power is not in getting vengeance on others. True power is actually in showing love to them. The most powerful person is the one who can always respond with love. Now, I think of Christian Piccolini, right, when he spoke to us a couple weeks ago. He said the reason he got out of the white supremacist movement was not because someone logically came up to him and explained why he was wrong, or someone held him at gunpoint and said, "You need to stop being a white supremacist." No, the reason he was able to get out of that sort of hateful ideology was because others showed love to him. They showed love to him even though he was the last person that deserved it. Is there not something beautifully strong about showing love to those who don't deserve it? And we'll skip this one. He says, "What is hell? I maintain that it is the suffering of being unable to love." This is such a great little one-liner here. So that the person who is unable to love others, in fact, they are in the greatest suffering imaginable. And I have to agree with him here. I can't imagine a worse feeling, a worse sort of dissatisfaction than being unable to love others. It makes me think of people that want to cause harm to others. We see this all the time in gun violence in the United States. They have to be in an intolerable hell. To want to cause harm to other people they have to have this burning hatred within them that has to be miserable. It has to be a sort of hell. And again, the only way to help an individual that has this sort of hatred of others, the only way to sort of dissolve the hell within them is not through force, it's not through hatred, it is only through love. Only love can drive out hate. So Father Zosima, while accepting that there is great suffering and there is great sin in this world, his sort of response back is, in the end, we can only use love. And in fact, perhaps even love is more powerful than the pain and the suffering that exist in this world. So here's my 3 questions for you, right? And you can honestly answer any way that you'd like. Did Dostoevsky provide an adequate response to this question of the existence of evil? Is humble love powerful enough to maybe defeat's not the right word, but respond to the suffering and evil of the world? And could it be true that beauty saves the world? Could it be true that selfless love and friendship and family actually are able and adequate enough to defeat the deep suffering that we see. So I just want you to, I'll post this on, it'll be on Google Classroom, obviously, and I just want you to answer 5 sentences. Just sort of, what are your thoughts about what Dostoevsky has to say? Does he provide an adequate response to the problem of evil? And you can make sure and just attach a document when you submit it. All right. I hope I didn't bore you too much. Maybe I did. I hope you enjoy your snow day, and I will see you guys soon. God bless.